I never thought the worst betrayal of my life would begin with a simple sentence spoken across my own dining table. "You should start thinking about where you're going to live after this house is sold," my daughter-in-law said as calmly as if she were discussing the weather. For a moment, I honestly believed I had misheard her. I was 68 years old, a widow for less than 3 months, and still learning how to wake up each morning without reaching for the hand of the man I had loved for 41 years. The dining room suddenly felt colder. The roast chicken on the table, the familiar family photographs on the walls, even the afternoon sunlight filtering through the curtains all seemed strangely distant. My son Ethan sat beside his wife, Brittany, staring down into his coffee mug. He didn't correct her. He didn't laugh and tell me she was joking. He didn't even look at me. That silence hurt more than any argument ever could. I remember folding my napkin carefully and placing it beside my plate. It was a small action, but it gave me something to do while my heart tried to catch up with what I had just heard. "Sold?" I asked quietly. Brittany offered a tight smile. "It's just practical, Margaret. This place is too much for one person. Property taxes keep going up. Maintenance costs are expensive. Ethan and I have been discussing options." Options. Such an innocent word. Yet somehow it made me feel like I was no longer part of the conversation about my own life. I looked around the room. Every corner of that house carried a memory. The hardwood floor Ethan had learned to crawl across. The kitchen where my husband, Robert, used to dance with me while waiting for coffee to brew on Sunday mornings. The backyard where we celebrated birthdays, graduations, and countless summer evenings under strings of warm lights. This wasn't just a house. It was the story of my family written into walls and windows. "I see," I said, keeping my voice steady. Brittany seemed relieved that I wasn't arguing. Ethan finally glanced up, but only for a second. There was guilt in his eyes. Guilt and something else. Fear. As if he knew something he didn't want to say aloud. The conversation moved on, but I barely heard another word. Instead, I noticed the small things. The way Brittany answered questions before Ethan could speak. The way she exchanged quick looks with him whenever money came up. The way my son's shoulders tensed every time I mentioned Robert's name. By the time they left that evening, the sun had disappeared and the house felt larger than ever. I stood alone in the quiet living room, staring at a framed photograph of Robert smiling beside me on our 40th anniversary. "Something isn't right," I whispered. For the first time since his passing, I felt something stronger than grief. I felt suspicion. And deep inside, a question began to form. What exactly were they trying so hard to keep me from discovering? The next morning, I woke before sunrise, just as I had every day since Robert passed away. For a few seconds, lying beneath the quilt we had shared for decades, I forgot that he was gone. Then reality settled over me again, quiet and heavy. The house was still. No footsteps. No coffee already brewing in the kitchen. No newspaper folded neatly on the dining table. I slipped out of bed and wrapped a cardigan around my shoulders before making my way downstairs. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, filling the silence that seemed to live in every room now. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood by the kitchen window. The maple tree in the backyard was beginning to change color. Robert always loved this time of year. He used to say that trees knew how to let go with grace. At the time, I thought it was a beautiful thought. Now it felt like a lesson I was still struggling to learn. As I looked across the yard, memories surfaced one after another. Robert repairing the fence on a warm Saturday afternoon. Ethan playing catch with him near the garden. Family cookouts that stretched late into summer evenings. Those memories should have brought comfort, but lately they felt different. They reminded me of how much had changed. After Robert's funeral, Ethan visited less often than I expected. At first, I told myself he was grieving in his own way. People process loss differently. But gradually, small things began to stand out. Phone calls became shorter. Invitations disappeared. Decisions seemed to be made without including me. Looking back, the change had started even before Robert passed away. Brittany had a way of taking control of every conversation. If I suggested a family dinner, she already had other plans. If Ethan promised to stop by, something always came up. Little by little, the distance grew until it felt normal. I carried my coffee into Robert's study. The room remained exactly as he had left it. His reading glasses rested on the desk beside a yellow legal pad covered with notes written in his familiar handwriting. I sat in his chair and allowed my fingers to trace the edge of the desk. That was when I noticed something unusual. One of the drawers was not fully closed. Robert was meticulous. He never left drawers open. Curious, I pulled it the rest of the way out. Inside were neatly organized folders, insurance papers, tax records, and household documents. Everything appeared ordinary until I noticed a manila folder near the back, labeled simply Property. My heartbeat quickened slightly. I opened it and found several documents related to the house. Most were familiar. Deeds, assessments, maintenance records. Then I noticed a page clipped separately from the rest. It contained notes in Robert's handwriting. At the top of the page, he had written a sentence that made me sit perfectly still. If anything feels wrong after I am gone, do not trust appearances. Verify everything. I read the sentence 3 times. The morning sunlight streamed through the study window, but suddenly the room felt colder. Robert had never been dramatic. He did not write mysterious warnings. He dealt in facts, not fears, which meant he had written those words for a reason. And for the first time, I began to wonder if whatever was happening now had started long before I realized it. For the rest of that afternoon, I remained in Robert's study with the folder spread across the desk in front of me. Outside, the neighborhood carried on as usual. A lawnmower hummed somewhere down the street. A dog barked in the distance. Ordinary sounds from an ordinary day. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. I carefully examined every page inside the folder. Most of it was exactly what I expected. Property tax statements, insurance renewals, home improvement receipts dating back years. Robert had always believed in keeping records. He treated paperwork the same way he treated promises, with patience and attention. Then I found another sheet tucked between 2 folders. It was not a legal document. It was a handwritten note. The date in the corner caught my attention immediately. It had been written only 6 weeks before he passed away. My hands tightened around the page as I began reading. Robert had listed several account numbers and contact names. Beside one name he had written, "Ask questions if anyone pressures you to make quick decisions." Beneath that was another sentence. "Some people become very interested in money when they think nobody is watching." I stared at those words for a long time. Robert never named anyone. He was not the type to accuse people without proof. Yet the warning felt deliberate, personal. I folded the note and slipped it into my cardigan pocket. That evening, Ethan called unexpectedly. The sound of his voice startled me because he had not called in nearly 2 weeks. "How are you doing, Mom?" he asked. His tone sounded careful, almost rehearsed. "I am managing," I replied. There was a pause. "Brittany and I were talking. We think it might be a good idea to meet with a realtor soon. No pressure. Just information." I looked around the living room. Family photographs lined the shelves. Robert's favorite chair sat beside the fireplace exactly where he had left it. "That seems rather soon," I said quietly. Another pause followed. "The market is strong right now," Ethan answered. Not because he wanted the memories preserved. Not because he was concerned about my future. The first reason he offered was the market. Something about that troubled me deeply. After we hung up, I sat alone in silence. Then I did something I had not done in years. I called an old friend. Harold Benson had worked with Robert for more than 20 years. They trusted each other completely. If anyone might understand what Robert had been trying to tell me, it would be Harold. When he answered, his warm voice immediately brought comfort. We spoke for several minutes before I mentioned the folder. The line became quiet. Too quiet. Finally, Harold sighed. "Margaret, there is something I have been debating whether to tell you." My heart began to pound. "What is it?" I asked. Harold hesitated again. A few months before Robert passed away, he asked me to keep an eye on something. He said he was worried about unusual conversations happening around the house. Conversations involving money, property, and plans that did not include you. The room seemed to shrink around me. I gripped the armrest tightly. Harold continued softly. At the time, he hoped he was mistaken. But he was concerned enough to start documenting things. I closed my eyes. Suddenly, Robert's warnings no longer felt vague. They felt like the beginning of a truth that somebody had worked very hard to keep hidden. That night, sleep refused to come. I sat in the living room with only a small lamp glowing beside Robert's chair, replaying every conversation from the past year. At first, the memories seemed harmless. Little comments, casual suggestions, moments I had dismissed because I trusted my family. But once I started looking at them differently, a pattern emerged. I remembered Brittany asking detailed questions about our savings during a family barbecue. I remembered Ethan insisting on helping organize financial paperwork after Robert's health began declining. At the time, I thought they were being supportive. Now I was no longer sure. The next morning, I drove across town to meet Harold for coffee. The diner we chose had been one of Robert's favorites. The booths were worn, the coffee was strong, and the waitresses still called regular customers by name. Harold looked older than I remembered. Grief had touched him too. Robert had not only been his colleague, he had been his closest friend. After we ordered, Harold reached into a leather briefcase and carefully removed a sealed envelope. My pulse quickened immediately. "Robert gave this to me 3 months before he passed away," Harold said quietly. "He told me to keep it safe unless certain things started happening." I stared at the envelope without touching it. My name was written across the front in Robert's unmistakable handwriting. Seeing those familiar letters felt like hearing his voice again. "Why did he not give it to me directly?" I asked. Harold folded his hands together. "Because he hoped he would never need it." For several seconds neither of us spoke. Finally, I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter. The first line alone brought tears to my eyes. Robert wrote that if I was reading those words, then events had unfolded exactly as he feared. He explained that during the last year of his life, he had overheard several conversations that troubled him. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just discussions about the future of the house, future inheritances, and plans being made without either of us included. He admitted that he had investigated quietly because he did not want to accuse anyone unfairly. As I continued reading, my chest tightened. Robert described noticing increasing pressure from Brittany whenever financial matters arose. He mentioned Ethan becoming unusually secretive after certain conversations with her. Most painful of all was a sentence near the end of the letter. "I believe Ethan loves you, Margaret, but love and influence are not always stronger than each other." I lowered the pages slowly. Harold watched me with concern. "There is more," he said. He then explained that Robert had met twice with an attorney during his final months. Not because he intended to change everything, but because he wanted safeguards in place. Protections. Measures designed to ensure nobody could manipulate decisions after he was gone. Suddenly the urgency surrounding the house made sense. The pressure. The timing. The carefully rehearsed conversations. Someone believed they already knew how this story would end. They believed I was grieving, vulnerable, and willing to sign whatever was placed in front of me. As I folded Robert's letter and returned it to the envelope, a strange calm settled over me. For weeks I had felt lost, confused, alone. But now I had something far more valuable than certainty. I had a reason to keep looking. And somewhere ahead, hidden beneath layers of polite smiles and careful explanations, the truth was waiting. When I returned home that afternoon, I did not feel frightened. I felt alert. There was a difference. Fear makes you want to run. Alertness makes you pay attention. For the first time in months, I began noticing details that grief had hidden from me. That evening, I opened a notebook and started writing down everything I could remember. Dates, conversations, small incidents that once seemed meaningless. The list grew longer than I expected. One memory in particular kept resurfacing. About 8 months before Robert passed away, Brittany had insisted on hosting Thanksgiving dinner at her house. During dessert, she casually asked whether Robert and I had updated our estate plans. At the time I laughed and changed the subject. But Brittany did not let it go. She asked follow-up questions. She wanted specifics. I remembered Robert becoming unusually quiet afterward. Another memory followed. Ethan had once called asking for copies of certain property records. He claimed he needed them to compare tax assessments for his own home. Robert provided the information but later mentioned that the request felt strange. Then there was the afternoon Robert spent nearly 3 hours meeting privately with his attorney. When I asked if everything was all right, he smiled and said he was simply organizing paperwork. Looking back now, I realized he had been protecting me without creating unnecessary conflict. The following morning I received another surprise. My doorbell rang shortly after 9 o'clock. Standing on the porch was Melissa Grant, Robert's former legal assistant. I had not seen her in years. She held a small box against her chest. "I hope I am not intruding," she said gently. I invited her inside. We sat in the kitchen while coffee brewed. Melissa looked nervous. Finally, she placed the box on the table. "Robert asked me to deliver this only if certain circumstances developed," she explained. My pulse quickened. Slowly, I opened the lid. Inside were copies of correspondence, notes, and several documents I had never seen before. None of them contained shocking revelations. Instead, they painted a picture. Robert had documented concerns over time. He recorded conversations. He noted unusual requests. He created timelines. Most importantly, he had written observations. One note caught my attention immediately. "Pressure often arrives disguised as concern." I read that sentence twice, then a third time. It perfectly described every conversation Brittany had initiated since Robert's passing. Each suggestion sounded reasonable on the surface. Sell the house for convenience. Simplify life. Reduce responsibilities. Yet every recommendation seemed to move in exactly one direction. Away from my independence. Melissa watched quietly as I sorted through the papers. "There is one more thing," she said. She handed me a sealed envelope bearing the logo of Robert's attorney. "This was not supposed to be opened unless you personally requested a review of your situation." I stared at the envelope. Whatever was inside, Robert believed it might become important one day. As I held it in my hands, I realized something had changed inside me. I was no longer reacting to events. I was preparing for them. And somewhere ahead, someone was about to discover that the grieving widow they expected was paying much closer attention than they ever imagined. For nearly an hour, I stared at the sealed envelope resting on my kitchen table. The late afternoon sun moved slowly across the hardwood floor while the clock above the stove ticked steadily in the silence. Finally, I opened it. Inside was a letter from Robert's attorney along with several legal documents. The language was formal, but the message was clear. Months before his passing, Robert had established a series of protections designed to prevent any transfer, sale, refinancing, or modification involving the house without multiple layers of review and direct confirmation from me. My breath caught as I continued reading. He had anticipated pressure. He had anticipated confusion. Most of all, he had anticipated that someone might attempt to convince me that selling quickly was in my best interest. The documents also revealed something else. Robert had created a separate trust containing assets that were not publicly discussed within the family. The details were confidential, but one sentence stood out. Any beneficiary found to be acting in bad faith toward another family member could face restrictions regarding future distributions. I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes. Robert had not acted out of suspicion alone. He had acted because he saw warning signs long before I did. 2 days later, Ethan called again. This time he sounded unusually cheerful. He suggested taking me to lunch. We met at a restaurant overlooking a small lake on the edge of town. For a while we talked about ordinary things. The weather. Neighborhood updates. Memories of Robert. Then the conversation shifted exactly where I expected it would. "Mom, Brittany found a realtor who specializes in helping seniors downsize," Ethan said. His tone was careful. "Practiced. There is absolutely no pressure. We just thought it would be smart to explore options." I smiled gently and stirred my iced tea. "That is thoughtful," I replied. Relief flashed across his face. He believed I was agreeing. "Maybe we could all meet next week," he suggested. "Perhaps," I said. "Before that, I have been reviewing some paperwork your father left behind." The change was immediate. Ethan's smile faded. "Not completely. Just enough." "Paperwork?" he asked. "Mostly legal documents," I answered casually. "Your father was very thorough." For several seconds he said nothing. Then he quickly changed the subject. The rest of lunch passed pleasantly enough, but I noticed something important. Every time I mentioned Robert's preparations, Ethan became uncomfortable. Not angry, Not defensive. Uncomfortable. As though he was worried about information he did not fully understand. That evening, as I pulled into my driveway, I saw a familiar vehicle parked across the street. Brittany sat behind the wheel. The moment she noticed me looking, she started the engine and drove away. Perhaps it was coincidence. Perhaps not. Either way, a strange certainty settled over me. The pressure was increasing because someone believed time was running out. And if that was true, then whatever they were hoping to accomplish was much closer than I had originally thought. The following week unfolded with an almost unsettling calm. Nobody argued. Nobody pushed. In fact, Brittany became unusually pleasant. She called twice just to check on me. She offered to bring groceries. She even suggested a family dinner at my house. If I had not spent the previous weeks uncovering Robert's preparations, I might have believed her concern was genuine. Instead, I watched carefully. I listened more than I spoke. And the more I observed, the more convinced I became that something was approaching. On Thursday evening, Ethan and Brittany arrived carrying a homemade pie and bright smiles. We sat around the dining table where so many family memories had been created over the years. The conversation remained light at first. Work. Local news. Upcoming holidays. Then Brittany casually placed a folder on the table. My attention immediately sharpened. Nothing serious, she said with a small laugh. We were talking with a financial planner, and thought some of these resources might interest you. I glanced at the folder without opening it. The cover contained brochures about retirement communities, downsizing services, and real estate consultants. I smiled politely. That was thoughtful of you. Brittany seemed encouraged. There are some wonderful places available right now, she continued. Beautiful apartments, community activities, maintenance-free living. I noticed she never once referred to my home as something worth keeping. Every example involved leaving. Every solution required moving. Ethan remained quiet throughout most of the discussion. Occasionally he nodded. Occasionally he looked down at his hands. The longer the conversation continued, the more I sensed conflict inside him. He was not acting like someone leading a plan. He was acting like someone following one. After dessert, Ethan stepped outside to answer a phone call. The moment the door closed behind him, Brittany leaned forward slightly. Her voice softened. You know, Margaret, sometimes holding on to the past can keep people from moving forward. The statement sounded harmless, wise even, but something about her expression told a different story. I folded my hands calmly. Perhaps, I replied. Although sometimes people rush toward the future without understanding what they are leaving behind. For the briefest moment her smile faltered. Then it returned. Later that night after they left, I opened the folder. Most of the materials were exactly what I expected. Yet tucked between two brochures was a business card. On the back someone had written a note. It included a date and an address. Curiosity overcame me. The address belonged to a conference room inside a local office building. The date was only 4 days away. First I assumed it was accidental. Then I noticed something else. The handwriting did not belong to Brittany. It belonged to Ethan. I sat quietly for a long time, studying the card beneath the kitchen light. Why would Ethan write down a meeting location and hide it among documents intended for me? Was it a mistake? A warning? Or perhaps a message he was unable to deliver directly? Whatever the reason, I knew one thing with certainty. 4 days later, someone planned to meet behind closed doors. And for the first time, I had an opportunity to discover exactly what they thought I did not know. 4 days later, I parked across the street from the office building and remained inside my car for several minutes. The business card rested on the passenger seat beside me. The address matched perfectly. The conference room occupied part of a professional complex that housed attorneys, financial advisors, and real estate consultants. Nothing about the location appeared suspicious. That was what made it interesting. People rarely hide important plans in dark alleys or secret warehouses. More often, they hide them in ordinary places where nobody thinks to look. I entered the lobby and sat near a row of large windows overlooking the parking lot. A newspaper rested open in my lap, though I barely read a word. Shortly after 10 o'clock, familiar vehicles began arriving. First came Brittany. She stepped from her car carrying a leather portfolio and walked inside without hesitation. 15 minutes later, Ethan arrived. His expression looked tense. He checked his phone twice before entering the building. Then came a realtor I recognized from one of the brochures Brittany had left at my house. My pulse quickened. This was no coincidence. The three of them disappeared into an elevator together. I remained seated, watching. Nearly 40 minutes passed before another figure entered the lobby. To my surprise, it was Harold. He spotted me immediately and walked over. His eyebrows rose slightly, but he did not appear shocked to see me there. "I had a feeling you might come," he said quietly. "You knew about this meeting?" I asked. Harold nodded. "Not the details. But Robert mentioned a possibility like this." We sat together in silence for several moments. Finally, Harold reached into his jacket pocket and handed me a folded sheet of paper. "I was waiting for the right moment to give you this." The page contained a list of names and dates. Several matched documents I had already seen. One name stood out immediately: the realtor. According to Robert's notes, Brittany had contacted that realtor almost 6 months before his passing. 6 months. I stared at the date. At that point, nobody should have been discussing the future sale of the house. Robert was still alive. He was still making plans. Yet someone had already begun laying groundwork. My stomach tightened. Suddenly the timeline looked very different. This was not a reaction to grief. It was preparation. An hour later, the meeting ended. People began leaving the building. Through the lobby windows, I watched Brittany smiling confidently as she spoke with the realtor. Ethan stood nearby, but he did not look happy. He looked exhausted. As they crossed the parking lot, something unexpected happened. Ethan glanced toward the street and saw me sitting inside my car. For a brief second, our eyes met through the windshield. His face went pale. Not because I was angry. Not because I was causing a scene. Simply because he realized I knew. He stopped walking. Brittany continued several steps before noticing he was no longer beside her. When she turned and followed his gaze, her confident smile vanished. I did not wave. I did not confront them. I simply started my engine and drove away. Sometimes silence speaks louder than any accusation. And judging by the expressions I had just seen, they finally understood that the widow they expected to outmaneuver was no longer several steps behind them. She was now standing directly in their path. The next morning my phone rang just after 8 o'clock. It was Ethan. His voice sounded strained, as though he had spent the entire night thinking about our brief encounter outside that office building. "Mom, can we talk?" he asked. "Of course," I replied. We agreed to meet that afternoon at the house. After hanging up, I walked through the familiar rooms with a sense of calm I had not felt in months. The uncertainty was gone. I no longer wondered whether something was happening behind my back. I knew it was. The only remaining question was how much Ethan truly understood. When he arrived, he looked tired. Older somehow. He sat across from me at the kitchen table where I had helped him with homework decades earlier. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, he sighed. "You were not supposed to find out like that." I folded my hands quietly. "Find out what, Ethan?" He stared down at the table. "Everything got complicated after Dad became sick." There was genuine pain in his voice. Not greed. Not anger. Pain. Slowly, pieces began falling into place. Ethan admitted that Brittany had spent months pushing the idea that the house would eventually become a burden. She talked about maintenance costs, property values, and future opportunities. First he resisted. Then Robert's health declined, and conversations about the future became more frequent. "I kept telling myself it was practical planning," he said. "But somewhere along the way, I stopped asking whether it was the right thing to do." His honesty surprised me. I had expected excuses. Instead, I saw regret. Real regret. I stood and walked to the cabinet where I had stored Robert's letters. Returning to the table, I placed one envelope in front of him. "Your father left this behind," I said softly. Ethan opened it with trembling hands. As he read, tears gathered in his eyes. Robert had written about family, about responsibility, about protecting the people we love rather than managing them. Near the end was a sentence that seemed to strike Ethan especially hard. "A good son does not inherit a house. He inherits the duty to honor the people who built it." When he finished reading, he sat silently for a long time. Finally, he looked up. "I am sorry, Mom." 3 simple words. Yet they carried more weight than any argument could have. Later that evening, Brittany arrived unexpectedly. She entered the house with confidence, but the moment she saw the documents spread across the table, her expression changed. For the first time since all of this began, she realized the situation was no longer unfolding according to her plans. I remained calm. There was no need for anger. The truth was already doing the work for me. Robert had spent his final months preparing for a possibility he hoped would never happen. Because of him, the house was protected. Because of him, important decisions could not be rushed. And because of him, the people sitting across from me were finally being forced to confront choices they could no longer hide behind polite explanations. As the evening sun filled the kitchen with golden light, I looked around the home we had built together. The photographs still hung on the walls. The memories remained exactly where they belonged. For the first time since Robert passed away, I felt his presence not as grief but as guidance. And I knew with complete certainty that this story was finally turning in the direction he had hoped for all along.